Okay, so it looks like the recording's in progress, and thanks for coming out for this idea of classical realism. This is going to be very exciting because classical realism is a lot unlike neorealism, which we're going to get into. So realism in a nutshell attacks, like I said in the previous video, the utopian liberalism. Remember when the League of Nations had collective security and they said all for one and one for all, just like the Three Musketeers, and that failed. Why did it fail? Well, it failed for a number of reasons. Number one, when Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, when Mussolini attacked it, he went to the League of Nations and it failed miserably to support him. Moreover, this whole Kellogg-Briand Pact of outlawing law just completely failed. So the classical realists basically said, you are projecting the domestic image, which is 911. We can call a 911 police officer, etc. See, if I mug one of you, you call the cops, they come to my house, and I say, I don't know who this person is, but that's the domestic image. There is no 911 in the world. So the classical realists started saying, no, the League of Nations is a total failure because there is no police force. And the classic realists are actually a lot richer in a lot of ways than the neo-realists. What is classical realism? Classical realism harks back to a whole broad spectrum of great philosophers and thinkers, but the problem is 160, we're not going to get into all this. So we're going to get into a few. Number one, Machiavelli. Machiavelli said a lot of things. He said, be a lion, be a fox. Lion is clever. A fox. No, wait. The fox is clever. The lion is the one that's strong. But never be hated. Because when you're hated, off with your head. Like if you took my in-class version of this class, POS 160, or any global politics class, you basically have the Tsar getting overthrown. We watch it. Somoza of Nicaragua, Batista of Cuba, General Doe of Liberia, switching to Africa, etc. Be strong like the lion and clever like the fox. Very important. And don't use that religious Christian, he would say, but I would say any kind of religious ethics internationally. You have to lie to be a good leader. Bismarck from Germany was a good leader for a lot of Machiavellian thinkers. He put together Germany, opposed to the inability of Caesar Borgia, and I know I'm probably pronouncing that name, of Italy, was just tricked and was never able to form a unified state. You have to be the lion and the fox. But this is important because this is about leadership characteristics. Leadership characteristics are very, very important to classical realism, as well as human nature, the lust for power. When you read Morgenthau's great book, which is still used today in some areas, it goes over a whole host of things. But Hans Morgenthau, understood something. And he understood power is ambiguous. It's not measurable like a lot of times we think they are. So if you look behind me, the classical realists a lot would say power is national character. Power is industrialization. You're going to see a list of ideas of Hans Morgenthau of what power is. National character changes. So when we talk about, for example, losing Afghanistan, right, or the failures in Iraq, those were very popular wars, but the national character of the United States changes over time. And when we went into Vietnam, which are the tunnels behind me, right, from a US perspective, it was very popular, but the national character of the country changed over time. And then you had massive protests, which definitely affected the ability to run this war. The other idea of power is look at behind me. These are the tunnels of Vietnam. You can actually go and see them now and go in them. Now, I obviously didn't take this picture. It's a little cartoon, but it shows you how strong the Viet Cong was. They've been fighting for so long. They had all these tunnels. And we, coming from a United States perspective, completely 100% denigrated The Vietnamese, we used racist terms, horrible terms for them, and they kept coming back and coming back and coming back until the fall of Saigon. And we used to call them just like, I just showed a movie in one of my other classes on the fall of the Tsar, when Russia was going to fight the Japanese. The Russians, not me, I would never say this, but like called the Japanese, all those yellow Buddhists, we can take them, they're easy. We underestimate our opponent, but they might have a power we don't understand. And in the Viet Cong, they had a power. They understood the land. Guerrillas understand the land. They had tunnels. They had the resolve. Things that obviously the French and the United States tried to fight them, didn't. The French were defeated in 1954 in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. It takes me a while to be able to pronounce those things. And then General Giap, famous Vietnamese general, there's a debate on this, right? On how great of a strategist he was. But the point is that he became known as a great strategist in Vietnam history, and particularly military history. And that in itself is a power. So power is very difficult to understand in an international setting. Just because the United States was able to defeat Japan and Germany, two industrialized powers, we weren't able to defeat the Vietnam. And the same thing goes with Sandino. When you start looking at Nicaraguan history, Sandino was able to defeat US soldiers. Sandino was a revolutionary history in the 20s, 30s in Nicaragua until he was killed by the Somoza dynasty. He knew the land. Nicaragua, if you know Nicaragua, it's a Central American country. Its topography, I lived there 8 years, is absolutely incredible. So it's very mountainous and very difficult to understand. And not only that, he defeated the United States military. And we forget to talk about this, of course, in history, because we don't like to talk about it. And then he stole the American flag. And he's, the Anti-Imperialist League is holding it up and other things. I'll have to show that at another time. But the thing is that what is power? Classical realists don't see it as measurable, like a lot of more quantitative researchers do. How do you measure power? And the classical realists are really more richer than the neo-realists. And I'm going to get into that because in alliance building, they're not all completely like the world is terrible, right? We can have peace, but it's usually through alliance building, balance of power, Thucydides's idea of the balance of power, right? If you read the Million Dialogue, you're going to see power against smaller powers, that it's the power to compel. That's what justice is in the international system. But he also wrote extensively about the alliance system, Sparta versus Athens, and the fight internationally to get alliances. And I see that to be true in a lot of ways. Think about it. World War II. Joseph Stalin is a pretty horrible person. But then when we needed him to defeat whom? The Nazis, he became Uncle Joe. So we support these people in alliances. Right? Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, but we support them in the alliance. So we're supporting them to fight the Houthis in Yemen. Iran is supporting Bashar al-Assad, not because necessarily they love Bashar al-Assad, but that's an alliance, right? We want alliances, and the United States has horrible alliances. As far as like Rios Montt of Guatemala committed genocide against the Guatemalan people. Well, the indigenous people. But he was in alliance with the United States of America. Why? Well, because during the Cold War, if you were anti-communist, you could kill, rape, murder. We didn't care. They were our alliance. And the same thing with Russia. So you start seeing that the alliance system, as Thucydides sees it, is very important for international politics. And this is true. Look at Taiwan. But the question is, do alliances like World War I drag us into conflict? One question, do we continue a strong alliance with Taiwan? Or if from the United States perspective, will Taiwan drag us into conflict with China? What do you do under these circumstances? This is what we support horrible, horrible people. and so does Russia, so does Cuba, so does everyone, right? So for the classical realists, though, these alliances are important. So when Carlos Andres Perez of Venezuela murdered up to 3,000 innocent Venezuelans in Caracazo, George Bush was on the phone with them talking to him. It came out in Fru's documents. We didn't mind, right? Because Venezuela at that time was an alliance. In fact, Carlos Andres Perez died in Florida. Same with Somoza. When Somoza, the brutal dictator of Nicaragua, was killed in Paraguay, they got him with the Uzi, a bazooka, I think. He was shipped to Miami, and the Miami, that's where his funeral was. But he was a brutal dictator. This guy killed massive people. Enrique Bermudez bombed indiscriminately barrios in Managua, where I lived, forcing the people of Managua to walk, which is pretty far, all the way to another town, Masaya. That's called El Repliegue. But Enrique Bermudez was considered a hero. He was a Contra. He was a, in fact, Colin Powell loved him, but he was the highest person in the military, the National Guard of Nicaragua. But it was the alliance. Somoza was anti-communist. Somoza, we helped train people in Nicaragua for the disastrous Bay of Pigs. It's absolutely horrible what countries do. But this is the alliance system. So Joseph Stalin is a horrible person, but yet at the same time, we make alliances with them in order to defeat the Nazis. But for the classical realists, this alliance building is through good diplomacy. Good diplomacy. It's leadership characteristics. The neo-realists see it more or less, they draw upon the classical realists, which I'm going to get into, but they basically think it's automatic, and I'm going to get into a lot of what they have to say. So the classical realists focus on anarchy. We live in an anarchic system, so there's no 911. Leadership skills are very, very important to these people. Alliance building is important. Since there is no 911, you need alliances. You need to balance other states. So it doesn't matter that Joseph Stalin was a murderer. We needed him in World War II. It doesn't matter that Rios Montt committed genocide. He was anti-communist. It doesn't matter Somoza. It doesn't matter the horrible governments of Honduras, El Salvador, killing and raping nuns. Dabuison of El Salvador had Archbishop Romero killed, but he was anti-communist, anti-FMLN. That's the guerrilla group in El Salvador at the time. So you basically get this idea, but it depends on the leadership characteristics. And I also want to get into classical realists really focus on human nature. They see a lust for power. Peace, we're not going to get it. There's always a lust for power out there. You might be a good person privately in your own private life, but international relations is about expansion, economic expansion, for power, glory, etc. And a lot of these classical realists like Hans Morgenthau grew up in Germany and saw this kind of like irrationality, this emotion of the Nazis. So they see a lot of human characteristics here. And that's where you get the lust for power. And Hans Morgenthau said all this law is just window dressing. The Nazis are taking over. And then they project that in the international stage. You see the League of Nations, all this stuff is just a failure. It's somewhat of a pessimistic view, but not completely. Or maybe completely, I don't know. That's going to be up to you. But this is very, very important to understand. So we live in a self-help system. A self-help system is one in which you only have yourself. And that means you need a military. So everyone needs a military because everyone's out to get you, basically. And the neo-realist took this to a different level. And I'm going to give you a quick thing. They're very similar to the classical realists, in fact, that they see anarchy. And there's a lot of policy prescriptions here, because if you don't see these institutions like the United Nations as being valuable, then you don't want to fund it. You have other initiatives. You need to build a big military. It's the only way. But it gets problematic. The neo-realists kind of think this is all automatic. When you watch the Mearsheimer video, that he's a quintessential neo-realist. He thinks automatically China will be a threat to the United States. It's not the leadership. It's not the type of government, communist, capitalist, authoritarian, it doesn't matter. It's just that as China grows economically, they're going to turn that economic power into military power. Let me drink some vodka here. Just kidding. I got it from Russia. Putin pays me to talk like this. So anyways, I'm kidding. But if he did pay me, I probably would take it. The point is, we have these now neo-realists that see it as an automatic thing. Whereas the classical realists are saying, no, this is human nature. It depends, but it depends on the leadership. You know, watch out for your power. It's not measurable. Mearsheimer and these more neo-realists see it as automatic. As China rises, automatically there'll be conflict. There's no way for any type of treaty to stop this or international institution. It doesn't matter the leadership in China. It doesn't matter whether they're communist or not. It doesn't matter. This is just how it is because we live in anarchy. And for them, because we live in a self-help system, we have what they call the security dilemma. The security dilemma is, since we have a self-help system, no one can rely on an international institution or a friend, because these alliances are always changing. I mean, we were friends with Venezuela. Now Venezuela is not our friend. We were friends with one country. Now it's not our friend. And it's not about human rights. Don't believe that. We support some of the most brutal regimes. Equatorial Guinea's Teodoro Obiang is friendly with us now because this is the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa, because he has oil. And he became kind of friend, and they made these relations, etc. But it's never about human rights. It's about friendship, right? It's about alliance. So what you need to take away from this is that the neo-realists see this as well, just like the classical realists, but for them, it's automatic. It's not emotional. They don't look at human characteristics. They don't actually look at leadership. They think that this is kind of an automatic thing, whereas the classical realists say, hey, look at good leadership like Bismarck. Right. The neo-realists also think like power is somewhat measurable. For the classical realists, like behind me, it's not measurable. You might be able to take Germany and industrialized power and Japan, but you couldn't take Nicaragua. You couldn't take Vietnam. When we get into later, well, this is more my national security class, you get into counterinsurgency stuff. You know, this is very, very important. Strategy, understanding the land, etc. National character, all these things. These are the things the neo-realists don't really look at. So since we live in a self-help system, like I was saying, you create more militarization. But that makes your neighbor nervous, and that's the security dilemma. The security dilemma in a nutshell is that because I need to have a military, my neighbor gets nervous. So if Iran wants nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia gets nervous and wants nuclear weapons. But it's not irrational, according to these neo-realists, to want nuclear weapons, because, you know, if like Iran, if you're in the middle of the Middle East and no one likes you, like Saudi Arabia, like the United States, like Israel, it's natural to want these types of weapons. So the neo-realists aren't even against it. In fact, Kenneth Waltz authored an article saying the Middle East would be more peaceful with Iran having nuclear weapons because they're defensive weapons, and that will create a better balance of power. Now I'm putting on my glasses because, you know, we're getting into really important stuff. When you put on the glasses, you know, it's important. So what do you think about this? This is where we will go. Now, you have to understand from a classical realist point of view, then you have to understand from the neo-realist point of view, there's a lot of similarity. In fact, the person who coined the neo-realist point of view, he used to work here, Richard Ashley. I worked with him. He became very famous, the poverty of neo-realism. And that's a really good article. In fact, I should have you peruse it. It's a very difficult article, but he basically, in a nutshell, says it's very bare bones, like kind of a microeconomic, like states are just, you know, unitary actors, and they go and butt heads like billiard balls on a billiard table, and they look for alliances, they get alliances, they balance, etc. And there's no kind of human nature, no human capacity, no emotion, no anything else, no craziness like the classical realists talk about. And, you know, it doesn't really get into that whole leadership skills, etc. It's just we live in anarchy, so therefore countries will develop their own militaries, and then that will make other neighboring countries scared. That's the security dilemma. It's a dilemma, and we'll eventually have conflict, like Mearsheimer says. And that's one of our first debates: is the rise of China a threat to the United States? So this is something that's very interesting to me, and it is, and it should be interesting to everyone, because it's interesting, because if we're talking about alliances, right, and we live in a self-help world, should the United States continue, right, with Taiwan? And I want you to think about that. In fact, I'll put that out on a for a discussion board question. Here, as you can see behind me, not sure if you can see me looking at for these things. That's Sandino, who I talked about before. That's a museum in Nicaragua, who was able to defeat the United States. Well, the United States left, basically, and then supported what became known as the Somoza dynasty to take them on. And that Somoza killed them, the first Somoza, and that became a strong ally in the United States history, even before the Cold War. And in 1979, Somoza was overthrown. It says Sandino Vive. And it became an enemy, the Sandinistas. But the problem is its leadership capacity, because should have we been an enemy of the Sandinistas or not? Because they weren't, I lived there 8 years, they weren't really communists, but that's the same thing happened in 1954 with Arbenz, who really wasn't a communist, but the United States overthrew him and destroyed Guatemala. So the question becomes, you know, in this alliance, looking for alliances during certain times of stress in the international system, should we overlook the human rights abuse as one of our alliances? And do we even need those alliances? And that becomes another topic for another time, but that's where you get into leadership skills. So the idea here to take away is think about what the real difference between classical realism, right, and neorealism are, right? We talk about human nature, Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War around 431, 434 BC, I'm reading. As you might be able to see, that was about getting Greek alliances to defeat Persia. And that's very important. Thucydides wrote about that. Then you've got Morgenthau, which talks about power. You know, power is ambiguous. It's land, resources, it's industrial capacity, it's quality of diplomacy, like I said, Bismarck. It can be public opinion, like I said, with Vietnam. We were all gung-ho in Vietnam, and then the national character started to become anti-militaristic. So you can't really quantify what power is. You can't put it in, like we'll see with behavioralism. When you watch Bueno Mesquita's video, that's what we call behavioralism. He's using quantitative research, right, in order, and I teach the stats class, an upper level stats, if you do take it in class, which I love. I use RStudio, which is a free open source, and I do a lot of statistics, but that's the behavioralist movement that came forward in political science. But the behavioral movement, now you don't have to be a neo-realist, but basically you can measure things internationally. And that becomes problematic because, as you see, when he actually talks about predicting Iran's future, because we don't live in a self-contained lab, it's very difficult to predict things in the international system, like the rise of Trump. Trump won the election in 2016. And is he still president? Because I thought he was coming back. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. I don't know what's going on with that. The only thing I know is the January 6th insurrection was absolutely amazing, because that's my birthday. People don't know that, but I'll tell you now. January 6th is my birthday. And that's also Little Christmas, the day the world changed. If you were brought up Catholic like me, the three wise men, or maybe women, came with presents to that kid. What's his name? Jesus Cristo. So there you go. I learned that in Catholic school, and I was born on January 6th. What a great day to celebrate during the insurrection. But Bueno de Mesquita never, ever predicted Trump. No one did. No way. I don't even think Trump knew he was going to win. And then what did Trump do when he killed the Iranian general? So how can you predict the future of Iran when you can't? It's not a lab. You can't self-contain the world and control for what we call these confounding variables. Those are variables you can't control or the researcher doesn't consider, etc. So this is very, very important to understand because international politics is well, crazy. And there's a lot of social construction there. There's a lot of propaganda, etc. But what I want you to take away from this, first, you have to understand, right? Classical realism. Then you have to understand to a certain degree neorealism, which builds off this classical realism, but it's a little different because it doesn't take into account so much about leadership, about human nature, about emotion. Classical realists talked a lot about this. We can't get in too much because it's a 160 class. Talked a lot about it. And you know, the neorealists were the self-help, like the classical realists, but then the security dilemma, which is when you develop your military, you automatically scare others. So if the United States develops international systems of weaponry, Russia gets nervous, and then they need those. So this is like, you know, it helps explain the space race or the nuclear arms races, etc. They also see the state as a unitary actor and a unit of analysis to study. And that's problematic as well for the neorealists, because as you know, there's a lot of non-state actors, Al-Qaeda, 9/11, that actually work, that are very important. The Kurds, Palestinians, right? Palestine's not a state. So many others, that paramilitary groups that are non-state actors that we have to consider. And they're often considered, quote unquote, the neorealists are often considered structural realism, and tries to predict what the world will be. And that's very difficult because I just said, like Bueno de Mesquita, although Bueno de Mesquita is not necessarily a neorealist, but he's using quantitative research to predict, but it's very difficult to use 100% science. And that's where the neorealists and classical realists kind of divide as well, is classical realists are seeing the world as more motion, human nature, national character, etc. Power is not measurable. Whereas the more neorealists and Bueno de Mesquita, being a behavioralist, are saying we can measure it. It's kind of like, you know, a more scientific understanding of the world. And that's it. And I hope, you know, people who are taking this class before the midterm exam, you come out, and I always do a Zoom with the students prior to the midterm exam. You come out and ask questions, because there's no way I explained everything well. In fact, if I explained anything well, I'd be surprised. I'm only kidding you. But thanks for coming out and listening to this lecture on the difference between classical realism, neorealism, a lot of their major tenets and how they see the world, and then also the behavioralist movement that tries to even build on that kind of neorealism, structuralism of the ability to see the world not as like the humanities, but as measurable, more scientific way to see the world. And that will be, I'll leave it there and see what you people think of all this information and allow you to digest it. So thanks for coming out, everyone, and stay safe, because the COVID is still there.